Elias built a life alone, so he'd never fail anyone again. But fate delivered a wounded girl to his doorstep, and neither of them would ever be the same. Elias Ward had long since stopped expecting anyone to come down the dirt track that led to his gate. The land stretched wide and bare, with mesquite and dust as his only companions, and he liked it that way. He had built his ranch to be a place apart from the noise of town, from the talk of men who asked questions he never cared to answer. Each day he rose with the sun, checked the herd, mended fences, and spoke to no one but his horse and the wind. The gate stood at the edge of his world, weathered wood and rusted hinges, a line between solitude and everything he had left behind. That evening the sky burned orange with the last light of day, the kind of glow that made the desert seem almost kind for a moment. Elias was carrying a coil of rope when he saw something strange by the gate. At first he thought it was a sack thrown from a passing wagon, caught against the posts, but as he drew closer, his boots crunching in the dry dirt, he realized it was no bundle. It was a body. A girl lay slumped against the wood, her thin frame half in shadow, her dress torn and streaked with dust. He dropped the rope without thinking and hurried forward, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. The girl's skin was pale beneath the dirt, her hair tangled and falling across her face. When he knelt beside her, he saw a dark smear at her temple where blood had dried. She was breathing, shallow but steady, each breath rattling like a dry leaf caught in wind. Elias pressed his rough palm against her forehead and felt the heat of fever beneath her skin. She had walked a long way under the desert sun, or been chased, or worse. For a moment he froze, caught between the habits of solitude and the pull of instinct. He had built a life where no one depended on him, where he could not fail anyone because there was no one left to fail. But here was this child, no more than 16, broken against his gate like fate had carried her straight to him. He thought of walking away, fetching water first, giving himself a breath to think. Instead, he slid his arms under her, light as lifting a sack of grain, and carried her through the gate toward the house. The door creaked as it always did, the air inside cooler but thick with the smell of leather and dust. He laid her on the spare cot he had not touched in years, the blanket stiff from disuse. She stirred faintly, her lips parting, but no words came. Elias fetched water, dampened a rag, and pressed it to her brow. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment her eyes opened, wide and dark with fear, but too weak to focus. She tried to speak, only a broken whisper falling from her mouth, and then she slipped back into silence. Elias sat back, his hands heavy in his lap, staring at this stranger who had collapsed at his gate. He had chosen solitude to keep the world away, but the world had come anyway, not with guns or debts or ghosts, but in the form of a half-dead girl who had nowhere else to fall. And as the night settled around the ranch, Elias understood that his quiet life would never be the same. Elias carried the girl as though she were made of glass, her body light in his arms, her head rolling against his shoulder with each step. He laid her down on the spare cot in the corner, a bed he had kept for years without purpose, its blankets stiff and smelling faintly of cedar. He stood for a long moment above her, staring at the rise and fall of her chest, wondering who she was, where she had come from, and what kind of trouble had driven her to his gate. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her dress torn and dirt-stained, and the bruise on her temple spread purple and ugly across skin too young to carry such marks. He fetched water from the basin and tilted it against her mouth. At first she did not move, but then her lips parted slightly, and she swallowed in small trembling gulps. When her eyes fluttered open, they were wide and dark, filled with fear that went deeper than the pain in her body. She blinked at the ceiling, then at him, as if unsure whether he was real or just another cruel trick of fever and exhaustion. Her voice came out ragged, a hoarse rasp that made his stomach knot. "Don't send me back," she whispered, the words breaking like dry twigs in the silence. Elias did not answer right away. He had not been asked for much in years, not since before the war took his brother, before the land itself had claimed his peace. He had built a life where questions had no place, and now here was this girl, looking at him as though he held the power to cast her back into some hell she had fled. He pulled the chair closer to the cot and sat, his elbows resting heavy on his knees. "You're safe here," he said quietly, not knowing if it was a promise he could keep, but knowing it was the only answer she needed. Her eyes closed again, but her fingers clutched at the blanket as though she feared it would be taken. He stayed beside her until her breathing grew steadier, until the trembling in her body eased. The lamp on the table threw a soft glow across the room, and Elias watched her face in the shifting light. She was younger than he first thought, no more than 16, maybe less. Her cheeks hollow from hunger, her skin marked by more than the bruise at her temple. She looked like someone who had known cruelty long enough that kindness seemed foreign. Outside, the wind pressed against the boards of the house, carrying the smell of dust and sage. Elias rose to check the door, making sure the bolt was firm, then glanced out across the yard. Nothing moved but the shadows. He thought of the riders who sometimes passed near his land, men who carried trouble in their laughter, and his jaw tightened. Whoever she had run from might come looking. When he turned back, she was awake again, her eyes fixed on him with a look that was both desperate and suspicious. She did not thank him, did not ask where she was, only whispered again, "Please, don't send me back." Elias knelt, so his face was level with hers. "You're not going anywhere tonight," he said, his voice firm but gentle. For a moment her eyes softened, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. She turned her face to the wall, holding the blanket close, and Elias felt the weight of a choice pressing in. He had lived alone for years, but now the silence of his house had been broken, and he knew it would not return. Morning came soft across the dry land, the first light creeping through the gaps in the wooden shutters and spilling across the floor. Elias had risen before the sun, as he always did, moving quiet through the house so as not to wake the girl on the cot. He had fed the horses, checked the water troughs, and returned with a bucket of fresh water from the well. When he stepped inside, the room still smelled faintly of smoke from the lamp that had burned low through the night. The girl stirred beneath the blanket, her face pale in the dim light, her hair tangled around her cheeks. He set the bucket down and poured a cup of water, then carried it to her side. Her eyes opened slowly, wide and uncertain, as though she had forgotten where she was. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her lips dry, her gaze wary. Elias held the cup close, but did not force it. "Drink," he said softly, his voice steady. Her fingers reached out, thin and trembling, and she took the cup from him. She sipped carefully, as if even water might betray her. When she had finished, he asked nothing, only set the cup aside. She lay back against the pillow, her breaths still uneven. At last, her lips parted, her voice a whisper, almost too faint to catch. "Anna," she said, and then closed her eyes like the word itself had cost her more than she could afford. Elias waited for more, but nothing followed. No family name, no story, only that single fragile thread. He nodded slowly, accepting it for what it was. "Anna," he repeated, as if to anchor it in the room. He brought her a plate of bread and beans, plain food but warm. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. When he placed the plate in her lap, she hesitated. Her hands shook as though she half expected him to snatch it back, or strike her for taking too much. Elias turned away, giving her space, tending to the stove, though there was nothing to tend. Behind him he heard her eating in small bites, cautious, like an animal testing a trap. Her silence filled the room, not the easy kind Elias knew from years of solitude, but the sharp kind born of fear. He did not press her, though questions pressed against his own tongue. Where had she come from? Who had marked her with bruises? Who was she so afraid would find her? He saw the answers written in the way she hunched her shoulders, the way her eyes darted toward the door whenever the wind rattled the latch. She was hunted, or cast out, or both, and shame rode her as heavily as hunger. When the plate was empty, she lowered it with careful hands, as if returning it was part of some bargain. Elias took it without a word. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, and she looked away quickly, cheeks flushing as though she had broken some rule. He felt a tightness in his chest then, an ache he had not known in years. Outside, the day grew bright, the sun laying itself across the land, but inside the little house, time felt slower. Elias worked in silence, moving between the door and the stove, while Anna sat on the cot, clutching the blanket, saying nothing more. Yet her name lingered in the air, small but real, and he knew it was the start of something that neither of them could turn away from now. The days moved slow after Anna gave her name, slow in the way the desert moves, one breath of wind carrying into another, until you forget where the hours have gone. She spoke little, her silence clinging to her like a second skin, and Elias did not try to tear it away. He had lived too long with silence himself to mistake it for emptiness. Sometimes silence was the only thing a person had left. He saw it in her eyes, the hollow cast of them, the way she watched the world without believing it could offer her anything worth holding on to. He had seen that look before, in the glassy stare of men dying on the range, and in the mirror when he was younger and thought he had nothing left. At night, when the lamps burned low and she finally slept, Elias would sit by the window with a cup of coffee gone cold and let the ghosts slip in. He remembered his brother, Samuel, tall and reckless, who went off to fight over a strip of grassland against another rancher's herd and never came back. Elias had carried his body from the field, dirt and blood caked together, his eyes wide open in the same way Anna's were when she startled awake from a dream. He remembered the woman he once promised himself to, Clara Jean, her letters folded and kept in his chest for months, each one speaking of a future she never truly meant. She married another man while Elias was breaking his back under the sun, waiting for her word. He told himself he had left all that behind, but when Anna sat at the table in the morning, staring at her bread like she wasn't sure she was allowed to eat it, he saw Clara Jean's betrayal and Samuel's death written in the lines of her face. He wondered what she had lost, what had been stolen from her so young that her shoulders already carried the weight of defeat. She never told him, and he never asked, but her silence was not empty. It was filled with screams she dared not give voice to, filled with the shame of wounds no one had cared enough to tend. Sometimes when the wind rattled the shutters, she would flinch as though expecting someone to come through the door. Other times, she would sit by the fire and run her fingers over the blanket he had given her, her gaze fixed far away, as if the flames showed her places Elias could not see. Elias found himself wanting to speak, to tell her that broken things could still stand, that ghosts did not own the living, but the words stayed lodged in his chest. He had spent years choosing solitude, so he would never again fail someone who leaned on him, never again watch another life slip through his hands. Yet here she was, silent and small in his house, and he could not look at her without feeling those old failures stirring. One evening, as the sky bled red over the horizon, Anna sat outside the door with her knees drawn up, her eyes distant. Elias leaned against the post, the memory of Samuel heavy on him. He almost told her then about the brother who laughed too loud and died too young, about the woman who had left without goodbye, about the way loneliness carves a man until he no longer recognizes his own reflection. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came. He only said, "You'll be safe here," knowing it was not the whole truth, but the only truth he had strength to give. Anna looked at him then, her face pale in the twilight, and for a moment the hollow in her eyes softened, as though she had caught the faintest echo of something she thought she had lost. She did not smile, but she did not turn away either, and that was enough for Elias to feel the ghosts loosen their grip, if only for a breath. Anna began to walk the fence line with Elias in the mornings, her steps unsteady at first, the blanket he had given her pulled tight around her shoulders until the sun rose high enough to warm the air. She said little, only nodded when he pointed out a post, leaning, or a gap where the wire had sagged. But she followed, her eyes never settling on the earth beneath her feet. Instead, she scanned the horizon, always the horizon, as though danger would ride out of the far distance at any moment. Elias kept his words plain and short, not out of impatience, but because he could see that each sound startled her, as if she was listening for voices that had once barked orders, or worse. The days stretched out in their pattern. He carried tools and wire, she carried a small bucket with nails, and together they walked the boundary of his land. Sometimes she stopped, without warning, her body going rigid, her eyes fixed on a distant speck of dust that might be nothing more than wind. He would wait, quiet, until her shoulders eased, and she moved again. He did not press her to explain, but he saw how her fingers clenched at the bucket, white, knuckled, as if she were bracing herself against a blow. One morning when the sky was heavy with clouds, thunder rolled low across the hills, far off but strong enough to rattle the earth. Elias glanced at her and saw her face drain of color, her shoulders folding inward. She dropped the bucket, nails scattering in the grass, and pressed her hands to her ears like a child. For a long moment she stood frozen, her chest rising and falling too fast, eyes wide and empty. Elias picked up the nails and set the bucket back in her hands, steadying her with a touch that was firm but gentle. "It's only weather," he said, though he knew it was more than weather to her. She gave a small nod, but did not meet his eyes, and he did not ask. Later, as they sat on the porch with the storm rolling closer, Elias saw the scars on her wrists. They were thin lines, some old and faded, others newer, raw against her pale skin. She tried to keep them hidden beneath her sleeves, but when she lifted the cup of water he had given her, the light caught them, and he could not unsee it. He felt the ache of questions pressing against his throat, but he held them back. If she had wanted to tell him, she would have. The weight of her secrets was already heavy enough, without his hands trying to pry them loose. At night the silence between them grew thicker, not the easy quiet of men who share a campfire, but the kind that creaked like old wood, full of things unsaid. Elias would sit by the lamp, mending gear or shaping a piece of leather, while Anna curled beneath the blanket on the cot, her face turned to the wall. He could hear her breathing, steady at first, then breaking into small hitching sobs she tried to bury in the cloth. He never turned, never spoke, but the sound stayed with him long after it faded. He knew then that she carried wounds deeper than the bruise at her temple, wounds that no salve or bandage could mend. She had been broken in ways a man like him could barely imagine, and still she walked the fence line each morning, her gaze fixed on the horizon, refusing to let the world catch her standing still. Elias did not know if her silence would ever break, but he knew he would not force it. He had ghosts of his own, and maybe, in the quiet, they could bear the weight together. The morning was quiet in the way only the desert could be, the air cool before the sun began its climb, the ground still holding the shadows of the night. Elias went to the gate as he always did, checking the hinges and the posts, a habit born more from caution than need. That was when he saw them, clear as ink against the pale dust, the marks of horses that had come too close. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the ground where the riders had slowed, circled, and then turned away. He crouched, his hand brushing the edges of the tracks, his jaw tightening. Men had been here, watching maybe, and then gone again. When he told Anna at breakfast, her spoon stilled in her hand. She did not ask how many or how close, only stared down at the tin plate in front of her. He saw her knuckles whiten around the spoon, her shoulders drawn tight as wire. They came near, then rode on, he said, his voice even. Could be nothing, but he knew it was not nothing, and from the look in her eyes, so did she. Her face had gone pale, the color drained as if the news had stolen it away. She whispered something too low for him to catch, a single name maybe, before clamping her mouth shut again. He let it rest. though the weight of it pressed heavy between them. All that day she walked the fence line with him, but her eyes never left the horizon. Every gust of wind that stirred the grass made her stiffen. Every raven's shadow sliding across the dirt made her flinch. When he paused to mend a post, she stood behind him, her gaze fixed outward, and he could feel the fear rolling off her in waves. He wanted to tell her she was safe here, but the tracks in the dust had unsettled him too, and he would not lie. That night she woke screaming, the sound sharp enough to shake him from sleep. He lit the lamp and found her sitting upright on the cot, the blanket clutched to her chest, sweat dampening her hair. Her lips moved fast, whispering names over and over, names he did not know, names heavy with the sting of memory. He reached out, but stopped short of touching her, his hand hovering above her shoulder. She did not seem to see him at first, her eyes wide and lost, trapped in some place only she could see. At last she stilled, her breathing ragged. He asked nothing, only set the lamp on the table and poured water into a cup. She took it with shaking hands, drank, then lay back down, turning her face to the wall. Elias sat for a long time in the chair by her bed, listening to the slow return of her breaths, watching the shadows tremble on the walls. Outside, the land slept in silence, but Elias knew the world beyond his fence was moving, riders tracing lines through the dust, circling closer with every day. He had chosen solitude to keep the world out, but now it pressed against his gates, and Anna's fear told him the storm was not far off. He could not chase her secrets from her lips, but he could feel their shape in the night, heavy as the hoof prints that still marked the earth at his fence. The day was bright, the kind that made the hills shimmer in the distance and the air feel heavy with heat. Elias had been repairing a loose board near the barn when he noticed the flicker of movement along the ridge. At first he thought it was a trick of the sun, shadows bending across the rocks, but then he saw them clear. Two riders sitting tall on their horses, watching. They did not move closer, only lingered, the sun catching on the metal of a rifle, slung across one of their saddles. Anna came out of the house with a bucket for water, her face lifted toward the ridge without knowing why. The moment her eyes found them, the bucket dropped from her hands, spilling across the dirt. She staggered, her breath breaking, and before Elias could reach her, her knees gave way. She collapsed, her body folding as though the sight of those men had struck her harder than any blow. Elias caught her arm and steadied her, his eyes never leaving the ridge. He moved her back to the house, set her in the chair, then stepped into the doorway with his rifle across his arms. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his jaw fixed hard. He made no show of aiming, but his stance was clear. This was his land, and the men on the ridge were not welcome to cross it. For a long stretch of minutes the riders remained where they were, one leaning forward in the saddle as if weighing the distance, the other laughing low enough that the sound carried on the wind. Elias did not move, did not speak, only waited, steady as stone. At last the men turned their horses. Dust rose behind them as they rode off, their figures shrinking until they were swallowed by the hills. Elias lowered the rifle but did not relax. He stayed in the doorway until the dust had settled, until even the echo of hoofbeats was gone. Only then did he turn back to Anna. She was still shaking, her hands clenched white on the arms of the chair. Her eyes were wide and wet, her face pale as bone. For a long time she could not form words, only whispered broken sounds that tangled in her throat. Elias crouched down in front of her, his voice calm, steady, the same voice he used with frightened horses. "They're gone," he said, but she shook her head violently, as if the word meant nothing. At last, the dam broke. Her voice came in pieces, raw and trembling. She told him she had run from a house where safety had never been hers, from a man who had taken her in as a stepchild, only to trade her like livestock when the weight of mouths grew too heavy. She told him her father was dead, and the man her mother had married saw no reason to keep another burden. He had handed her over with a shrug. with words that cut sharper than any whip. Strong enough, he'd said, doesn't complain, and she had been given away as though her life was worth less than the horse she'd been tied to. The words poured from her like water breaking through a cracked dam, her face burning with the shame of it. She expected disbelief, maybe anger, but Elias said nothing. He listened, every line of his face hard and dark, but his eyes never left hers. When her words faltered, when she sank back into the chair sobbing softly, he finally spoke. "You're not going back," he said. Simple, steady, like a promise nailed into the earth. Anna closed her eyes, her shoulders still shaking, but something in her posture loosened. For the first time since she had stepped onto his land, she let her head rest against the back of the chair, as though she believed him. Elias rose and set the rifle back in its place, his chest heavy with a resolve he had not felt in years. Whatever had been chasing her, whatever had stripped her down to fear and silence, would not find her here without finding him first. Elias sat long into the evening after Anna's confession, the lantern flame flickering against the walls, the silence stretched heavy between them. She had spoken her truth in broken words, and now she sat curled in the chair with the blanket wrapped tight, her eyes red but dry. He did not ask more. He did not question the details or demand proof. The pain in her voice had been enough, the way it trembled like a raw wound left open. He had seen men lie, seen them weave stories to twist pity into gain, but this was not that. This was the voice of someone who had been broken and handed away like she had no soul of her own. Elias leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his weathered hands hanging loose. For years he had told himself solitude was strength, that turning his back on town and family was the only way to keep from losing again. But as he watched Anna shiver under the blanket, too afraid even of rest, he felt the lie of it press down on him. Solitude had not been strength at all. It had been running. It had been cowardice dressed as peace. He had chosen empty nights over the risk of losing more, and now here sat proof that the world did not leave you untouched, no matter how far you built your fences. The desert wind moaned outside, rattling the shutters, and Elias finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice a man used when words were few but meant to last. "You can stay here," he said, "for as long as you need." He looked past her as he said it, out into the dark, as if speaking not just to her, but to the land itself. So the promise would hold. Anna's breath caught. She lifted her eyes to him, wide and uncertain, as though she feared she had misheard. "You mean that?" she whispered, her voice raw. Elias nodded, the lines around his mouth, deep in the lamplight. "I mean it." He did not soften it with conditions, or time, or warning. The words stood on their own, firm as fence posts driven deep into the ground. For a long while she said nothing, only studied his face, her fingers tight around the blanket. Then slowly her shoulders eased, not all at once but enough that some of the iron in her spine bent. She lowered her head, and though she did not weep, her breath came out in a shaky sigh that carried more weight than tears. Elias leaned back in his chair, the decision heavy in his chest but steady too, like a stone that had finally found its place. He knew what it meant. It meant riders might come again. It meant danger crossing his land, men who would not care about promises or kindness. But it also meant he would not be alone anymore. Not in the way he had been. For the first time in years, he did not feel like the silence in his house was a shield. It felt like a burden, one he was ready to lay down. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Anna's eyes had closed, her body finally surrendering to sleep. Elias stayed awake a while longer, listening to her breathing, steady now, not broken by sobs or fear. He stared at the fire dying in the stove, and for the first time in years he felt that he was not just a man waiting out his days, he was a man who had given his word, and that word tied him not to solitude, but to life again. The days stretched into weeks, the rhythm of ranch life carrying them along like the steady pull of a river. At first, Anna clung to the edges of the work, standing back with the blanket still draped around her shoulders, watching Elias mend wire or feed the horses, as though afraid her presence might be unwelcome. But Elias, without pressing, began to hand her small tasks: a bucket of grain to scatter, a nail to hold steady while he drove the hammer. She took to them slowly, her hands clumsy, but each day she lingered a little closer, her fear loosening one thread at a time. The horses were the first to draw her out. She stood stiff when Elias led her into the corral, her eyes wide at the restless shifting of hooves. He showed her how to hold out her palm flat with an apple, how to let the animal come to her instead of forcing it. She flinched when the mare's breath tickled her skin, but when the soft lips brushed the apple away, something like wonder flickered across her face. Elias saw it and felt something stir in his chest, quiet but strong. By the end of the week she was brushing their coats in long strokes, her movements more certain, the horses nudging her as though they recognized her gentleness beneath the fear. She learned to light a fire next. Elias crouched beside her with flint and steel. Her first attempts were shaky, sparks falling dead into the dry grass, her frustration building until she nearly gave up. But he steadied her hands, showed her how to shield the tinder from the wind, how to breathe gentle into the small flame until it caught. When at last the fire leapt up, she sat back on her heels, her face glowing with triumph. For the first time, Elias heard her laugh. It came out awkward, sharp as though she did not know the sound belonged to her, and it startled them both. She pressed a hand to her mouth, embarrassed, but Elias only nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Mending fences became her favorite chore. Walking the line with him in the cool mornings, carrying nails and wire. She stumbled often, her shoes thin, but each fall she rose quicker, brushing herself off with less shame. Elias began to notice she no longer scanned the horizon as desperately as before. She still looked, always cautious, but her steps were firmer now, her eyes less haunted. The land that had once seemed only a place to run through was slowly becoming a place she belonged to. For Elias, teaching her was its own quiet awakening. He had thought himself long done with words beyond the bare minimum, but now he found himself explaining, demonstrating, watching her eyes follow his hands. In showing her how to tie a knot, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to judge the weight of a saddle, he remembered lessons once given to him by his brother, by his father, voices he had tried to bury. Each task shared with Anna pulled those ghosts back into light, but softer now, less painful. It felt as though he was relearning how to live, not just endure. In the evenings, when they sat by the fire with the smell of beans and wood smoke between them, the silence was different. Not the sharp silence of secrets, not the hollow silence of grief, but a quieter thing, companionable, shaped by trust. Sometimes Anna's laugh would break it, awkward still, but each time steadier, as if she was learning the sound of her own voice again. And each time it came, Elias found himself listening close, holding on to it like a man who had been starved of warmth and was just beginning to taste it again. The sun was dropping low, painting the sky with streaks of red, when the sound of hooves broke the quiet of the valley. Elias had been stacking wood by the barn, and Anna was bringing water from the well. The rhythm of the hooves was wrong, too heavy, too careless, the sound of men who wanted to be heard. Anna froze, the bucket tilting in her hands, water spilling into the dust. Her face went pale before the riders even came into view. Elias set down the wood slow, his body tightening with a readiness he had not felt in years. Two figures appeared over the rise, the same men who had lingered on the ridge before. This time, they did not stop at the horizon. They rode straight down toward the house, their horses kicking up trails of dust, their voices carrying ahead of them. One of them called a name, Anna's name, stretching it out in a cruel sing-song. The other laughed, a sound sharp enough to split the air, and shouted that she ought to come back before she forgot where she belonged. Anna dropped the bucket and stumbled back toward the house, her hands trembling. Elias reached for the rifle that leaned by the doorway and stepped forward, planting his boots firm in the dirt. His voice when it came was calm, but it carried like iron. "This is my land," he said, raising the rifle enough for the barrel to catch the last light. "The girl is under my roof. You will not touch her again." The men pulled their horses to a slow stop a short distance away. One spat into the dirt, his grin crooked. "She's not yours to keep," he said, his tone mocking. "Her people gave her up. She belongs where we say she belongs." Elias did not flinch. His shoulders squared, his eyes steady. "Not anymore," he answered. "She stays here." The rifle stayed leveled in his hands, not waving, not trembling. His stance made it clear he would not back down. The other rider laughed again, but there was less ease in it now. He shifted in the saddle, glancing at Elias's face, at the steady line of his arms. He muttered something low, too far to catch, then jerked his reins. The horses turned, restless beneath them. One called over his shoulder that this was not the end, that they would be back. Their laughter trailed behind them as they rode off, smaller and smaller against the horizon until only dust remained. Elias lowered the rifle, but kept his eyes on the distance until all was still. Only then did he turn back. Anna stood in the doorway, her body shaking, her eyes wide with terror and something else, something like disbelief. She looked at him as though she had never before seen someone stand between her and danger. He set the rifle back against the wall, his movements deliberate. "They won't take you," he said, his voice steady, meant as a promise. Anna pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath shuddering, and nodded. But even after the riders were gone, she kept trembling, the fear running through her like a fever. Elias guided her back inside, the weight of what had just happened heavy in his chest. He had spoken his word in front of her and in front of the men who thought they owned her. Now there was no turning back. Whatever storm those riders carried with them, he had made his choice. The air was heavy the next morning, the kind of stillness that made every sound carry sharper than it should. Elias had risen before dawn, checking the herd along the east pasture, the rifle never far from reach. Anna stayed close to the house, her eyes sweeping the horizon the way they always did, though today her fear seemed sharper, as if she too felt the weight of something pressing near. By mid-morning the sound came, hooves drumming against the earth, more than two this time. Dust rose along the ridge, and soon the riders came into view, 4 of them, their shadows long against the rising sun. Elias moved toward the barn with calm steps, though inside his chest his heart beat hard. He leaned his back against the post and waited. Anna came to the doorway, her hands tight around the frame, her face pale. The riders slowed as they neared the house, their laughter cruel, their words thrown sharp across the distance. They called for Anna by name again, mocking, saying she had no place here, saying a girl couldn't choose her fate against the will of men. Elias stepped out then, rifle in hand, his boots crunching steady against the dirt. He stopped halfway between the house and the riders, his stance rooted like oak. "This is your last warning," he called, his voice even, though the sound carried like steel against stone. "Turn back. You won't have her." One of the riders raised his pistol high, a grin cutting across his face. "We'll see about that, old man," he shouted, and the first shot rang out. The crack split the silence, echoing off the valley walls. Elias dropped to a knee, returning fire with a sharp precision born of years he thought he had left behind. The report of his rifle boomed, and one of the riders jerked in the saddle, his horse spinning wild as he fell. Gunfire erupted then, the valley filled with smoke and dust, the air thick with the thunder of hooves and the sting of powder. Bullets struck wood and earth, splinters flying. Elias felt the bite of one tear across his side, hot and sudden, but he did not fall. Gritting his teeth, he steadied himself, firing again, his shots finding their marks, each one forcing the men back a little more. Anna cried out from the doorway, but her voice only fueled him. He stood tall despite the pain, his rifle firm, his eyes hard. The riders cursed, one clutching his arm, another swaying in the saddle. Their bravado cracked under the weight of his defiance. At last they turned their reins, retreating with shouts and oaths, the thunder of their horses fading into the hills until the valley was still again. Elias staggered then, his hand pressed to his side, where blood seeped through his shirt. Anna was at his side in a heartbeat, her small hands steady even as her breath shook. She guided him inside, lowering him onto the chair, and tore cloth to press against the wound. Her eyes glistened, but her voice was firm. "I won't leave you," she whispered, binding the wound tight. "Not now, not ever." He looked at her, his vision blurred, but the steadiness in her face cut through the haze. She was no longer the frightened girl who had collapsed at his gate. She was stronger now, her hands sure, her words unshaken. Elias let out a slow breath, the pain sharp, but the weight of her promise heavier still. For years he had chosen silence and solitude, but here was the bond he had never dared to hope for, sealed not by blood of kin, but by the fire of standing together. Spring came slow to the valley, the kind of change you almost didn't notice, until one morning the air smelled different, the earth softer underfoot, the grass pushing up in tender shoots where only dust had been. The rains had come and gone, short but heavy, washing clean the dry ridges and filling the creek until it sang again. Elias walked the land with a quiet sense of wonder, seeing green where for years he had only seen brown, and beside him Anna moved with the same steady steps, no longer stumbling, no longer clinging to shadows. At the gate, the place where her body had once crumpled in the dirt, she knelt with a pouch of seeds clutched in her hands. The earth was damp and forgiving, and she pressed her fingers into it, planting wildflower seeds one by one. Her hair hung loose about her shoulders, the breeze lifting it as she worked. Elias stood above her, leaning against the post, watching. He remembered the night he had carried her inside, the weight of her frail body against his arms, the fear in her eyes when she first opened them. Now she dug into the soil with purpose, her hands steady, her face calm. It struck him that this, more than anything, was proof she had chosen to stay. When she rose, brushing dirt from her palms, she looked up at him with a small smile. "Flowers here," she said simply, her voice stronger now, though still quiet. "So I'll never forget where I began again." Elias nodded, his throat thick. He had no answer, only the silent agreement that this land, once a place of solitude, was now something more. They spent their days side by side, riding the fence to check for breaks, tending the herd, mending what needed fixing. Elias showed her how to guide a young calf back to its mother, how to tell when a storm was coming by the tilt of the clouds, how to patch a saddle so it would hold for another season. She learned quickly, her hands growing calloused, her shoulders stronger. Sometimes she laughed now, a sound that came easier with each passing week, and every time it startled Elias in a way that softened him. He had lived so long with silence as his only companion, he had forgotten how much life a single laugh could carry. At night they sat by the fire, the flames casting long shadows against the walls. They didn't need many words. Anna would hum sometimes under her breath, and Elias would sit back with his pipe, letting the sound settle into the cracks of the house that had once felt too empty. He realized then that he was no longer the man who built fences to keep the world out. He was a man who had opened his door, and in doing so, had found something worth keeping. They were not father and daughter, not bound by blood or name, but something stronger had taken root. They had both been broken, cast aside, yet together they had made a place where neither needed to fear being given away again. When Elias rode the fence line now, Anna rode with him, her posture upright, her eyes scanning the land not with dread, but with belonging. And when he looked across the valley, he no longer saw loneliness stretching wide. He saw home, made new by the bond they had chosen, forged from ruin, strong enough to endure. If this story left its mark on you, Subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.